Hello everybody. At some point I really am going to have to buy a Jag because people keep bringing them to me and I keep really enjoying them. And today's Jag is one that for a very long time has been overlooked, but I think now is the time for its second coming. We're talking about the S-Type. Obviously not the original, the reborn one that landed in 1999. I think it's fair to say that Jaguar has never been a particularly mainstream company, and the S-Type was a key component of their transformation into a firm that was a little bit more closely aligned to its rivals. You see, even by the early 1990s, Jaguar's German competition had their model hierarchy all very clearly laid out, and so everybody knew which car it was they wanted to buy depending on their position in the company they worked for. At the bottom end you had the 3 Series, the A4 and the C-Class. For the more middle management types you had the 5 Series, the E-Class and the A6. Then for the top end executives you had the A8, the 7 Series and the S-Class. Of course things like the Mondeo were still doing pretty big business back then. You had the Cavalier eventually morphing into the Vectra, so on and so forth. The idea of the company rep doing big miles using their car as a status symbol was one still very much alive and well at the turn of the century. And Jaguar, for whatever reason, seemed to have absolutely no interest in it. If you wanted a Jag, you could buy an XJ. And if you wanted a more economical Jag, you could buy an XJ with a slightly smaller V8. Not really very good if you were on a budget. Ford had acquired Jaguar a few years earlier and set about turning it into a profitable business. I have in a few videos spoken down perhaps of Ford's ownership, but the truth is, without them, Jaguar probably wouldn't be around today. So I really should take the time to say thank you, Ford, for saving Jag and I guess having an overall positive contribution towards the brand. Even if you could argue there was a lot more they could have done, and their ownership of Aston Martin at the same time in many ways probably hamstrung the firm's ambitions as well. It should probably tell you everything you need to know about Jaguar's inexperience in the more affordable end of the market that when they finally did release a car that was officially a rival for the 3 Series, they launched the X-Type with V6 engines and all-wheel drive. Jaguar clearly weren't listening to what the market dictated. However, today we're not talking about the X-Type. I've done that already in another video. We're talking instead about the S-Type, which launched a few years before. I actually remember the S-Type with a fair degree of fondness. If you cast your mind back to around 2000, which by my maths is around 10 years ago, in the same way that 1980 is 20 years ago, and my father was shopping for a new car. Business was doing reasonably well and he wanted to upgrade what it was that he had. I can't actually remember the car that he was driving. It may have been a 996 C4 and he wanted something a little bit more relaxing. So he was looking at a Jag, and what he wanted was an XJR. He took me to look at one at the Jaguar garage in Ipswich, now another dealer just down the road from the football ground. I would have been about 10 at the time, and I told my father in no uncertain terms that if he bought that XJR, I would never forgive him. It was an old man's car and it was desperately uncool. Yes, I have learned the error of my ways. At the time, things like supercharged V8 meant absolutely nothing, and I recall distinctly that the previous owner of the car Dad was looking at was a lord. It would have been a marvellous way to get about, and I'm sorry, Dad, for ruining your dream. I know he still wants an XJR of that vintage, and he never had one. What he got instead was an S-Type, because to me that looked a little bit more modern. Yes, the mind of a child is a strange thing, and I'm aware that the S-Type was a deliberately very retro looking car. However, it was actually a new one. It was very strange times in the late 1990s because Rover had also gone quite retro with the new 75. And the owner of this car, Thanos, no, not that one, has also brought me his Rover 75 to review previously. He still got it, but it started becoming a little bit problematic. So he wanted to get himself something a little bit nicer for his daily commute. He originally started looking at the XF, which is a close relative of this, but found the one he drove a little bit lackluster. He wanted a diesel for the economy, but instead wound up buying one of these. And I've got to say, There's a lot to like about it. Only a couple of years ago, you could pick up a working, running S-Type, complete with MOT, for less than £1,000. But today, all of the cars at that price point are advertised as spares or repairs, and you need to spend close to £2,000 instead to get yourself something that's not going to be a world of hurt. The key question then is, are they worth it? And I would have to say, yeah, I kind of think they are. Very recently, I drove an E39 BMW 5 Series, a car that this was directly targeting. And the E39 is a fabulous thing, one of BMW's finest achievements. So it says a lot that if you gave me the choice now, I think I might have to buy the Jag. Why is that? First off, there's nothing else that looks quite like this. One of the problems I have with the X-Type is that it looks very much like an XJ, and that's unfortunate. The XJ is a very good looking car, but it does still have those very classic 3-box proportions that are not to all tastes. Even now I look at some of them and go, from some angles great, and others not so much. This seems a little more cohesive, even if it is a deliberate throwback. There's not always anything particularly wrong with that either. The choice of engines reflects the time in which this car was launched, because it came out originally with V6 and V8 petrols. There was then also a 2.7 litre diesel, which was the sole oil burning option this ever received, and later the range was joined by a smaller 2.5 litre V6 and a Meteor supercharged V8 for the S-Type R. A car that I've driven and greatly enjoyed. Those have already gone up in money quite a bit. The owner of this, when I asked him why he hadn't bought one of those, said that yeah, they used to be $5 or $6,000, and now you're going to pay about 10 for a good one. So the market for these is already on the way up. The exact S-Type that my father bought, I still have a picture of, because Jaguar used to give you a little illustration of your car, which I thought was quite a nice thing. I have one for both that and the XKR that came afterwards. The S-Type that he eventually went for was a sport model, and it had a few subtle touches that made it look a little bit less retro and a little bit more aggressive, that made it the car he wanted to buy. Those included black trim for the windows rather than chrome, it had a sportier suspension, a different interior treatment, and some fairly nice looking split rim alloy wheels. He had it for I think a couple of years, and it was a pretty darn good car all said and told. The XKR that he got afterwards was a lot more hassle to run. This particular car is a much later example. It's a 2007, so very much the last of line for the S-Type. There were a couple of facelifts throughout the S-Type's production run. For more details on what they did, check out a buyer's guide. But in short, they upgraded the interior so it felt just a little bit more modern. In fact, down here feels almost exactly like the later XF. This touchscreen down here was something that came with one of the later models, and to be honest, even when it was new, didn't exactly feel up to date. But happily, there is a system out there called JagDroid, which you can use if you want to maintain the screen but still have more modern functionality. That's very, very handy and makes these cars still quite relevant. I found a brochure from a couple of years earlier because I was trying to work out what exactly it was that you got with the SE. As far as I can tell, with the Sport, the manual gearbox was still standard. However, with this, a 6-speed automatic ZF was the only transmission option. In fairness, I don't think many people ever bought an S-Type with a manual. They do exist, but they're not common. There is a sport mode for more vigorous driving, but in truth, I've actually found this is the kind of car that I have no interest in putting my foot down in. It'll rev cleanly and nicely and does have just about enough pace to keep you entertained, but that's not what it's all about. If you want that, that's where the R really comes into its own. Earlier cars had a 5-speed auto, and the 6-speed is definitely an improvement. So if you're looking for one of these now, that's certainly something worth seeking out. A later car also means you're likely to avoid this car's major problem, which is rust. You see, generally, these seem to be quite a good car to own and run, but they suffer from corrosion badly. That's not to say Jag were the only company to suffer with these kinds of issues. Mercedes in the 1990s were also pretty bad. The Japanese never seem to bother with rust prevention, and the Italians don't know what rust is. But if you can find a car which isn't riddled with tinworm, what you have is something that is rather nice. They aren't the lightest of things. They have an all-steel chassis shared with the Lincoln LS of the time and, bizarrely, the Ford Thunderbird. Now that is an oddball, retro-futuristic looking type thing that's just a very, very strange car. If anyone in the UK does have one of those, I'd love to drive it, but I'd be amazed if anyone in the UK actually has one of those. The chassis construction means that even this example, equipped with the base 3-litre V6, still weighs over 1.7 tonnes. It produces 240 horsepower, so a modicum more than the old BMW 3-litre M54, and 221 pound-foot of torque. That's about 300 newton metres. When you combine it with the more modern 6-speed ZF box, it doesn't actually feel as inadequate as you might imagine. That being said, if fuel economy isn't too much of a concern, I would say you probably appreciate the extra oomph that you get from the V8. The added power is lovely, but it's the extra torque I think you're really going to enjoy, and it will certainly feel a little bit more like a Jag. Despite being fairly light, which is correct for this type of car, the steering even has a little bit of texture and feel coming through it, which means you feel a sense of attachment to the road you often don't in larger cars. This is one of the hallmarks that makes a Jaguar quite so special. There are a few things that combine a Jaguar's ability to cross ground with its comfort and refinement. The only time the car's composure is broken is over the more rough and sharp edges in the road. The brake pedal is fairly light, there is a little bit of dead travel in it, and then it responds quite sharply, but you'd expect it in a car like this, and it hasn't caught me out yet. It does more or less what you might imagine. The seats even do a better job than you might expect. They're actually very comfortable, leather, of course, and they do support you more than you'd think. However, it's not all good news in here, because there's a few elements that feel a little bit cheap. This stuff, for example, that's not leather, that's plastic. The switches down here look absolutely tragic, and while they might have been just about okay in '99, by 2007 they now looked pretty awful. It won't surprise you to hear that they, and many other things in here, are Ford-derived. But that's a very good thing. That may be the source of a fair bit of ribbing on the internet, including from myself. However, it does mean that to maintain one of these is going to be a lot easier, because they're all parts that are both cheap and readily available. In fact, when looking through S-Type buyers' guides, I found that there wasn't really an awful lot of concern. The big items were corrosion, and early engines did suffer from the Nickersill liner issue that many cars in period did. The truth is, if you're buying into one of these now, as long as it's got more than a few thousand miles on it, you probably already have known whether that was going to be an issue. 15 years ago, it would have been more of an active concern, but now I wouldn't give it a second thought. There is a fair amount of body roll in this car, and that does ultimately temper your progress. Grip is quite reasonable. Weather conditions today are somewhat mixed. The car happily is rear-wheel drive, and that chassis, although heavy, did also have fully independent suspension. I've heard many rumours that the later Mustang, the sort of 2015 one, was actually based on more or less this chassis platform, but I've never seen much to be able to confirm that. People in the comments, perhaps you can help me out there. Is that true? Was the new Mustang just a Jaguar S-Type / Lincoln LS all tarted up? Answers on a postcard. I'll even demonstrate here the turning circle of the car, which is pretty good. Off-roading ability is decent. Chunky sidewalls on these tyres. It's a good car to manoeuvre. Visibility is decent, although placing the car at the rear is tricky. Fortunately, this does have parking sensors, which I would say are pretty essential. These aren't exactly small cars, just under 5 meters long, but despite that, interior space isn't excellent, a common Jaguar problem. Boot space is good, but again, compared with their rivals, not stellar. I don't think it's really enough of an issue to put anyone off the car, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention it. Now, while a certain Mr. J. Clarkson of Yorkshire has painted the image of every single Jag owner as a lovable rogue / art thief, delete as applicable, the truth is that Jag people generally are really quite nice. But more importantly than that, everybody on the road seems to like a Jag. So when my dad had his, my mum had an E46 330. Very much similar sort of thing, I suppose, 4-door saloon car. And yet, if he ever had to take Mum's car to work, he would hate it. Because to get out of our driveway, you'd have to turn right onto a main road. And in the Jag, he'll be let out almost immediately. In Mother's BMW, there'd be enough time to get a crossword or two done before anybody would want to let you out. It sounds silly, I know, and it's been a very, very long time since I've had to commute in rush hour traffic, but if any of that is even still remotely true, it might be one of the little unexpected bonuses of Jag ownership that you get to experience. I'm quite impressed too with this car in terms of creaks and rattles, because there really aren't many. By the time the S-Type was done, Jaguar had shifted nearly 300,000 of them. Today, I don't know how many remain, but it is exactly the sort of car people would have considered disposable, especially when they dissolved so easily on your driveway. I am the first person to tell you never buy a car purely as a financial investment, but at this end of the market, you don't have an awful lot to lose. £2,000 to £3,000 will pick you up a very good example of an S-Type, and if anything out there had a chance of holding its cash, it's probably one of these. The fuel economy is not stellar. The car has averaged 28.5 since the last time the trip counter was reset, and I'd say that's a fairly realistic lifetime average. On the motorway you will get in excess of 30, but that's not really anything to write home about. The benefit, of course, is that these days people really don't want diesels anymore, and so the petrol, which for a long time would have been overlooked, is now the desirable one. And a car like this may still be able to get into certain congestion zones without having to pay an extra fee, meaning any savings you'd have made in fuel with a diesel are going to be wiped out the moment you try and go into central London. If you are just doing motorway mileage, the diesel's probably still worth trying. The 2.7 was regarded as a pretty good engine in its day, but I'm not sure I've actually driven a car with it in. The most disappointing thing is that Thanos tells me he finds his Rover 75 is not just a sportier drive, but it's actually also a little bit nicer inside too. And where this has plastic, the Rover has leather. And it's a strange old time when you say that a Rover is sportier and more luxurious than a Jag, which would have cost quite a bit more when it was new. Okay, by the time this car came out, Rover had ceased to exist, and maybe that had something to do with it. But otherwise, this is still a very good car. The biggest thing for me that would get in the way of buying an S-Type is the fact that an XF isn't a lot more money, it is a little bit newer, and an XJ is no more money at all, and is a much nicer, much higher end car. Offsetting that is the fact that an XJ is going to cost more to run. You could get those with the same engine in, and my friend George has an XJ6 like that. Fabulous thing. They're not even any heavier, in fact they might be lighter because those are all aluminium. But if things do break, there is a chance that in the XJ it's going to cost you a bit more, and you have the added complication of things like the air ride system to deal with, and they can be troublesome. The S-Type is a far simpler car. There's still plenty of these available, which means you can be picky with what you buy. There are loads of Jaguar specialists, particularly in the United Kingdom, and the Ford connection should mean that even if you aren't in these sainted aisles, you should still be able to find all the parts you need to keep one of these going without breaking the bank. As ever, if you've got a car you'd like to see featured on the channel and I haven't done one already, please drop me a line. My email address is in the description of every video. For now, please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.